Yeah, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Uh, this is the 61st issue of our ENOC DigiConnect webinar series, and you are all welcome to this webinar series. As you all know that for last 1.5 years, we had been connecting with each other on this ENOC DigiConnect webinar, and every week we request a guest speaker, renowned guest speaker, who comes and share his knowledge, so that we are all enlightened with the latest developments in the field of COVID management. And as we all know that we are suffering from this COVID pandemic situation for the last 1.5 years, and this is being a highly unpredictable virus. Although the second wave is on a downtrend, but still the third wave is imminent, as scientists say. So we need to be very careful during this particular time, and we need to take all precautions, and we need to get ourselves updated with the latest developments which are there. So in this regards, today's uh, guest speaker is also a renowned guest speaker for us. And may I request our President, Dr. Gajendra Kumar sir, to give the welcome address.
Good evening, friends. I welcome you all to this 61st web series of our program, which we are having for more than last 1.5 years on every Saturday evening. So today our guest speaker is Dr. Vineet Behra, who is a renowned nephrologist from Mumbai. And our second speaker is Dr. R.K. Jain. And Dr. Behra will be discussing on extracorporeal therapies in sepsis. I think the topic is going to be very interesting to all of us. So with these few words, I welcome all the participants and all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. With this, we go ahead with our today's webinar. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Vineet Behra. Dr. Vineet Behra is MD Medicine, DM Nephrology from All India Institute of Medical Sciences. He is a consultant nephrologist and associate professor of medicine, Mumbai. For your information, Dr. Vineet Behra, we are an association of industrial doctors, corporate doctors, railway doctors, and all industrial physicians. So across India, we are more than 2,500 members, and in Delhi, we are more than 250 members who are regularly updating ourselves with this knowledge of every week DigiConnect webinar series, and all our this repository can be referred on the ENOC DigiConnect webinar platform YouTube channel that is available. All these 78 videos are there, and a lot of views are there, and more than 106 subscribers are also there for this DigiConnect webinar. So we would like you also to refer this YouTube channel, and all these repositories can be in future, they can be referred by our colleagues across India. So today's topic is extracorporeal therapies in sepsis, role in COVID-19. And regarding Dr. Behra, he has done his MBBS MD from AFMC Pune and DM Nephrology from All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And he did ISN ANI Nephropathology Certificate course in 2018, and his awards and achievements are also quite a lot. He has received gold medals and 15 distinctions in MBBS, and Lieutenant General Inder Singh Gold Medal First MD Medicine, and Lieutenant General Ganga Dharan Gold Medal Best All-Round Officer. And he has written a lot of papers and research papers to his credits: 22 publications, PubMed Index, 8 international journals and 14 national journals, and 8 chapters in the books. And his areas of interest is intervention, nephrology, renal transplant. And today, actually, this extracorporeal therapies in sepsis, role in COVID-19, that is a very relevant topic, because we have seen that many of the patients who were there in ICU for a very long time. They suffered from sepsis and lot of specialized treatment were required. So in that case, we as industrial physicians, we also should be aware of all these developments. So accordingly, we can advise to our patients, our management. Yes, this how effective these therapies are. So Dr. Behra, you can start your presentation. If you have any presentation and your deliberation, you can start.
Thank you, sir. I'll just share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah, sir, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for all those kind words. I really don't know how much I am worthy of. I am very interested to know about your association and the magnitude of the work and the extent of involvement in that. Because of the monsoon, there is some bad net connectivity. I hope that the luck stays with me and I'm able to finish my presentation without any technical glitch. And so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you for joining me, and I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak on this topic, which is quite close to my heart and a very essential topic in present day world. And so I shall be speaking on extracorporeal therapies in sepsis and its present day role in COVID-19. I won't go into a lot of technical details and a lot of studies and research, and keep it as simple as possible. So please enjoy your Saturday evening, and I'll give you a light talk. So just sit back and enjoy. Okay. So before we start, I would like to welcome you from my institute, that is INHS Ashwini. It's a naval hospital, and I am a nephrologist working in that. So before I start, I would like to know that how many of you are fond of superhero movies? In fact, have any one of you, in fact, most of you would have seen superhero movies like Avengers. So this was one of the top grossing movies of all times. Came in three sequels, that is Avengers Infinity War. So how it behaves is that this person in center, called as Thanos, he is the villain and he is on to destroy the world. So all of these are the superheroes. You can see Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk. So all of them come together. And trust me, if you see this movie, you realize that this villain or Thanos is too strong for them. So taking this into our real life world, just imagine a small microbial agent, which is just a few nanometer in size and can really extend our health resources and cause so much of mortality because of sepsis. And take, for example, the coronavirus. One small virus has taken the whole world into task. All the governments, all research, all our medical facilities, medical strength is unable to contain it. So that is the extent of how dangerous or how harmful the sepsis can be. And all of you are clinicians, you all would agree that in present day world, the biggest cause of mortality, morbidity, and even financial expenditure in our country is just sepsis. And the amount of energy and resources we lose or we use to tackle sepsis is quite a bit. So for handling sepsis, we all have our superheroes, that are the various sepsis bundles. That is, all of you know that antibiotics, blood, oxygen, etc. And we would just speak about one of them. Okay, to start with, all of you are well aware about sepsis. That is, the first stage is something called as SIRS, or systemic inflammatory response syndrome, in which you have fever, tachycardia, tachypnea, and leukocytosis. It goes on to develop sepsis. If there is some organ damage, it is called as severe sepsis. And in the later stages, it transforms into septic shock. Sepsis can be caused by various organisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses, protozoa, and it can have protein manifestations affecting the GIT, respiratory, renal, cardiac, and multiple organ systems. This is a very important diagram. We would come to it multiple times. What happens? The basic simple mechanism of sepsis is that the organism or the infection releases some PAM and DAM products. They further cause release of cytokines, which triggers a cascade, and more cytokines are produced by this cascade, and it further forms a cytokine storm. This cytokine storm subsequently goes on and develops and forms a multi-organ dysfunction in which all the organs, it is the heart, brain, lungs, kidney, are affected, and which causes the final outcome, or which causes mortality. So I would want to understand this basic concept of sepsis, based on which our entire discussion and our therapy would be based. That is, whenever there is an initial insult, or a microbial insult, or any insult for that matter, there is firstly a pro-inflammatory response that is given in red. After that, the body starts mounting its immune response, and there is an anti-inflammatory response. Depending on which is greater, if the pro-inflammatory is greater, the patient may continue to die. And if you are able to control the anti-inflammatory or control the infection, there is recovery and improvement. So most manifestations are caused by this, the pro-inflammatory and the anti-inflammatory response, not the infection per se. So for the red part, that is the pro-inflammatory, we start antibiotics or antimicrobial agents to control that. But what about the anti-inflammatory response? Sometimes that may be very severe and may actually harm the individual. So all our efforts to control the cytokine storm is to limit this. That is, if we can somehow check the anti-inflammatory response and the inflammation by controlling the cytokines, maybe the damage to organs or multi-organ dysfunction may be less. So this is, as we discussed, there is a cytokine storm causing a vasoplegic shock, MODS, and it affects multiple organs. And for controlling it, if we can remove the cytokines, we can actually remove the capillary leak, save the heart, prevent microcirculation problems like DIC, and also prevent shock. So these are all the various cytokines and inflammatory markers which are active in sepsis. Say chemokines, pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, hormones, DAMPs, PAMs. So an ideal scenario or a dream for every physician would be to somehow remove that. So can we create a filter, or can we have a mechanism by which we can remove all of that? So it is theoretically okay, but practically impossible, because every product or every molecule has got a different size, different chemistry, so it's not possible. So we can create filters to target each product and remove that from the circulation, which will help us subsequently in decreasing damage. So with the concept of this, there was an advent of extracorporeal therapy in sepsis. Corporeal means something to do with the blood or the human body. So any treatment we are giving inside the human body, for example, antibiotics, inotropes, drugs, are intracorporeal. Suppose we take out the human blood, treat it outside the body, and then send it back. So it is something outside. So we call it extracorporeal. So this is basically of two types. I'll not confuse you much. One of these are the convective therapies, which are similar to a typical dialysis, and the other are adsorptive therapies based on the process of adsorption. We shall see it later. So the filtration therapies works on a basic principle that you have a basic membrane filter. The blood passes through this, comes out through this. During this time, there is another fluid going through a counter current mechanism, and all the unnecessary solutes and particles are removed. So this looks somewhat like this, like a normal dialysis, and involves procedure like plasma exchange, dialysis, high CRRT, all these things. Other thing which is slightly different is something called as adsorption. This filter has got several particles which contain various chemicals or molecules which will adsorb or catch onto the cytokine particles. So whenever a blood passes through this, what happens? This filter catches the various cytokine particles and removes it from the circulation. So the blood coming out from here is actually cytokine free, or those particular cytokines have been removed. What are the indications? The indications are all linked to SIRS or inflammation. That can be refractory septic shock, toxic shock syndrome, necrotizing fasciitis, meningococcal sepsis, various non-infective inflammatory conditions like pancreatitis, burns, trauma, liver failure. Of late, a recent interest has gone up in post-CABG cases or in cardiac surgery. So not to confuse you, just remember any condition which causes SIRS or a cytokine storm or a MODS is a potential for an extracorporeal therapy. And this is one of the most important commercially available product, which is called as toremixin or polymyxin column. It just looks like this. And inside this, it contains a porous substance which has got many fibers. It's got a very high surface area, and this mainly removes the endotoxins. Like we can remove endotoxins, we can also remove the cytokines. The most commonly available are the cytosol. So they check IL-6 or how much of the endotoxin of the cytokines have been removed. Even they are a porous filter with cellulose beads and are of different types. So it looks something like this. Yeah, it looks something like this. And if you break it up, there are a number of beads which have got a high adsorptive capacity, which actually hold on to the cytokines and filter the blood. So how do we set up, or how do we use it in something like this? So this is a catheter with two ends, like we have a central lines. So it is basically a dialysis thick catheter. And from here, it generally enters into the patient's vein, a central vein, maybe a jugular vein or a femoral vein. So that high flow of blood can be removed. So from here, you can see from the red port, the blood coming out. This is a pump here, which creates a negative pressure to draw out the blood. The blood comes out and it passes through this cytosorb or the cytokine removal filter, which has got those beads, which will remove or which will clear it off the various cytokines. Then it comes back into this collecting chamber and then goes back through the blue line into the vein again. So this pump can be made by a ECMO machine, by a dialysis machine, by any possible machine. And this is the basic concept. We can do it through different machines, different varieties. So let us not get into all that detail. Yeah, so this is how it looks like real life. This is in one of our patients. This is a dialysis machine. So you can see this is the dialyzer. The blood first coming through here and going through a dialysis machine. This the blue is our dialyzer filter. It comes out and then subsequently goes through the cytosorb. Here the cytokine removal takes place, and from here the blood goes back to the patient. So this is how it works. And the benefit is well proven. There are numerous studies in different aspects of in different patient subgroups which have comfortably shown and proven that there is a significant benefit of using extracorporeal therapies. And so we will not discuss that. So it's a well-known fact. And yeah, this is very important, that when to start cytokine removal therapy. And everyone knows it is beneficial, but the main key or the main deciding point is this, that how do you decide that whom to give cytokine therapy or whom not to give? So if you see the pathophysiology of sepsis, it all starts from here when the patient is having an infection, but he's stable. Gradually, the infection starts affecting the body. He starts having early shock. This is where we generally intervene, start antibiotics, central line, inotropes, etc., etc. Gradually, if the sepsis is severe, the patient goes into shock and has multiple organ dysfunction. If left untreated, it will go further into a stage of refractory shock or vasoplegic shock, in which he has shock, MODS, high lactate. So this is the last stage. And if still untreated, the patient finally dies. So this is the level when that inflammatory cascade starts. Now, where to start? So the best result of using cytokine therapy are at this stage. that what the guidelines say, that to use it when the patient is going into shock. And the best benefits are seen within the first 24 hours. And at this stage, when the shock has already set in, the benefit is doubtful. So, of course, there is some benefit. We can't turn off the benefit, but it is doubtful. And if you go to this stage, when the refractory shock and multi-organ dysfunction has totally taken over, there is no role. Unfortunately, many of our patients actually come at this stage, refractory shock or shock. So the benefit is less. I would, in my opinion and my experience, go one step further and imagine, why not intervene here? That is when the patient is just entering. This is the stage when the infection starts producing cytokines and start initiating the sepsis. So if somehow we can intervene here, so everything can be stopped. But the problem is that, how do we come to know? There are so many patients coming to the hospital, so many sepsis. So how do we come to know? So there comes the difficulty. So that is how we miss out. But ideally speaking, it should be started as early as possible. Later stage has not got much of a benefit. In some patients whom we feel that there is a single insult, suppose he has got an inflammatory injury, for example, a pancreatitis, or for example, he a very high risk patient, suppose a kidney transplant patient or a diabetic patient, comes with severe florid forms of fever and inflammation. So we can actually start here before the shock sets in. And I too have tried here. It is very useful. So this is again the $1 million question: when to start cytokine removal therapy? So early use is definitely more effective, but every patient who comes with sepsis, if you start using it, it will become unnecessary, and it is kind of overdoing. Moreover, the cost also goes up. Each filter costs about 80,000 to 1,000 to 80,000 to 1 lakh, and it's a single time use filter. So it is not possible financially. Moreover, a normal patient, if you tell him that I am going to dialyze you or give you a cytokine therapy, it would be cumbersome, so not feasible. At the same time, if you see the other spectrum, later use makes it less effective. It is practically very poor outcomes are seen when the MODS has set in. But unfortunately, many patients in our country come quite late, later stages. So even if we use it, but the efficacy is not that much. So balancing them is very, very important. And this is where the key decision lies. And I would strongly recommend that instead of choosing this, always have a high index of suspicion and treat early. You may overtreat a few cases, but you would actually save many lives if you treat early. So in our center, we have used, initially in our center, we used to use it for only in those sepsis, MODS, that second or third phase shock patients. But then when we started treating it early, say example, a patient comes with complicated malaria with various organ system involvement, it actually works well. Similarly, we used it in a case of post-cesarean, a lady who had postpartum hemorrhage, immediately went into, within 6 hours, into acute kidney injury, encephalopathy, pulmonary edema, and severe sepsis. And she actually dramatically involved that during the 6-hour or an 8-hour session of cytokine removal, we could see her inotropic requirement coming down and she improving. And I, as a transplant physician, often use in my transplant patients, if I'm suspecting heavy sepsis. We have used in complicated dengue, acute pancreatitis, a few cases of CABG. Yeah, these two indications are just, we have taken our experience and applied in patients of, one patient of severe drowning. And in our transplant patients, there is a problem called as reperfusion syndrome. So when the kidney, which is taken out from the human, from a cadaver or a dead patient and put into a new individual who is a recipient, there is a time lag. So when that new kidney starts working, there is a release of a lot of cytokines. So we have used in these two off-label indications. So our results were very good, and we would be publishing that also in due course of time. Now, coming to this thing, all of us are oversaturated and well aware of the COVID-19 scenario. It is a worldwide pandemic, and all of us are well versed with all the latest literature, guidelines, in fact, well aware of that. So I would just briefly touch upon it. Again, the inflammatory markers or the pathogenesis, you all are aware how the SARS-CoV enters into the body, how it affects the cellular and the humoral immunity, and how the various manifestations take place. I want you to concentrate on this slide. I'm sure you must be aware of this. So when the COVID virus enters the body, so the first phase or the first 5 to 7 days is called the viremic phase. That is, the virus replication goes up and there is multiple replication of the virus, and it's a viremic phase. So in this stage, we use agents like remdesivir, antiviral agents. So that lasts for 5 to 7 days. After that, in the second half, after about 5 to 7 days, the humans or the bodies, the viremia starts decreasing and the human response takes over. So this is the time generally when the patient starts healing, fever comes down, he starts improving. But in some unfortunate patients, this host inflammatory response becomes abnormal and he enters into this thing called as a hyperinflammation phase. This is the most important cause of mortality or the most biggest problem of COVID. As you know, 90% go by the viremic phase and then have a normal inflammatory response and become all right. The few unfortunate 5 to 10% who go into this hyperinflammation phase are the ones who have maximum mortality, go into ARDS, shock, acute kidney injury, and have a negative outcome. So taking our experience of cytokine removal earlier, if at this stage we can somehow act or intervene or target the cytokines or stop them from establishing, we can actually decrease the damage. So generally we have been using drugs like tocilizumab, ibratumab, and other things at this stage. But this point, there is a potential role of cytokine removal. So this is a different diagram showing the same thing. So this is the point when the host immune response goes into that hyperinflammatory phase, that we can intervene and minimize damage or control the cytokine storm and organ failure. If we act at this level, it is too late. So there is actually no point in acting at this level. Treatment options of COVID, all of you are very well aware, and the guidelines keep coming, keep changing. The drugs keep coming initially and again going off. So we had in the beginning, we had the use of hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, it went off. Then came the time of favipiravir, it also went off. Convalescent plasma has gone off. So present day, the only thing which actually works are steroids, anticoagulation, and remdesivir in the viremic stage, and some upcoming role of tocilizumab to prevent that inflammation. Despite causing so much mortality, we are not getting any treatment. So we have not been able to find out or target or I mean innovate a drug which can actually control these scenes, which are very very ghastly or very morbid scenes, which actually disturbs all of us. So this is the reason, because we have not found any drug, more and more trials are going on, more and more research is going on to find out some magic drug or some agent which would act as a panacea for COVID. So coming back to the same diagram which we saw earlier, that the cytokine storm. So suppose this is a COVID infection, if we can intervene somewhere here and control it, then maybe we can stop the MODs and stop the inflammation and do a magic. So a famous dialysis physician, a very senior person from Italy, Claudio Ronco, who has done the maximum research in dialysis, came out of the idea that COVID-19 is a cytokine-based therapy problem in which cytokines affect multiple organs, cause a variety of systemic effects in this article. And he gave the concept that maybe if we use extracurricular therapies, it can be beneficial. And in the next paper, he brought out various options that we can use things like CRRT and control this. Maybe we can use things like ECMO. Maybe we can use things like various anti-inflammatory agents, other agents, and cytokine removal therapy. So these are the various theoretical options which he gave. And this led to the research and more agents being tried and subsequently being developed. And so this was one of the early articles which came up in a very short small subset of patients, we showed that there was some benefit of this extracorporeal therapy. Subsequently, more and more articles came in, and which further proved that it has got a benefit. And subsequently, after it has come up, there has been a lot of evidence, and gradually the evidence is enough evidence, enough case reports, and and few randomized trials are also going on to prove this. But the whole concept remains where to intervene. If you intervene at the correct time, correct patient, he would improve, or else if you are late, he won't improve. And the regulatory status is that the US FDA gave approval in April 2020, and the Indian DCGI also gave approval last year that it can be used. Subsequently, many centers are using it. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has kept a very neutral view, saying that it should not be used upfront. Quite correctly, it is not a definitive therapy. However, theoretically, it is possible, as we discussed. And maybe as more and more trials come in, it is confirmed, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare might also revise their guidelines. So let us place into perspective that what patients of COVID would you use it? Firstly, let me clarify, this is only an adjunctive therapy. This is not the treatment of choice of COVID. It is only an adjunctive therapy. That is, it can be used apart from the other agents like remdesivir, steroids, or anticoagulants or tocilizumab. So in the patients who are developing these complications, that is, who are going into shock or who are developing moderate to severe ARDS, AKI, or that is renal failure requiring dialysis, or hemophagocytosis. So these are the patients where it has been tried and it has been found to be some advantage or some benefit, the cytokine removal or cytosol can be used. And numerous centers have come up with their own their own ways. So this center, Brescia center, mentioned that they should start tocilizumab first, and after about 48 hours, give a course of cytosol. Whereas another group says that whenever the patient goes on ventilator or he's on ECMO, with that you can use. So these are all, institutional guidelines. In our center, we haven't got the opportunity to use in many patients. We used in 2 patients, and the one patient, it was successful, and one patient, he ended up with a mortality. But of course, we can't be sure of the benefit because other agents like remdesivir, tocilizumab were also tried. So that's all what I want to say. The whole idea of my presentation was to highlight the established role of extracorporeal therapy in the management of sepsis. Trust me, many people are not aware, and many of the private centers are using it. It's a very good and effective form of therapy if treated early and if treated in time. And also to discuss the importance of, as I discussed, appropriate timing. So timing is the key. If we start early and in the correct time, he works. And we have to select a patient correctly. If you get a patient who is very sick, last stage, multiple organ dysfunction, triple inotropes, so I don't think you would benefit with that. And of course, the new thing that is discuss the emerging role of extracorporeal therapy as an adjunct in the treatment of COVID-19. So I would end my talk with a future perspective, that which is $1 million question, that what lies in front of us. So would we continue like this forever, or would we go back into our old days like this? Thank you very much. Thank you for the patient hearing. And any suggestions or comments or any queries, I would be very happy to speak or discuss that.
Thank you, Dr. Vineet Behera, for giving this enlightening talk about this extracorporeal therapy, which is definitely an adjunct therapy, not the definitive therapy for the treatment of COVID-19. And that too is indicated in patients who are about to go in cytokine storm, or they are in the shock, or they have to be placed on ventilator or ECMO. So what the important question which arises, as you have already elaborated also, that when to intervene is important and the timing is very important. So right now, actually, whatever indications you have given, I think they are based on the judgment of the on the treating physician or the clinical status of the patient. Can we decide on the basis of some levels of inflammatory markers, that what should be the level of inflammatory markers when it is better to start this extracorporeal therapy?
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. There are fixed criteria available. That criteria takes into account the duration of shock, what is this Apache score, how many organ systems are involved. So they take into account the different scores. And based on that only, they fine tune and it becomes an indication. And it is to be only started within 24 to 48 hours. Inflammatory markers, we can do procalcitonin and IL-6 as a routine. So if the levels are high, only we go. And if IL-6 or procalcitonin are normal, so then there is not much of a role.
Dr. Behra, are these indications or guidelines, they are some international guidelines, or
Yeah,
they are Indian guidelines?
So I didn't go into them because every product, say example, Toremexin filter or the Cytosorb filter has got its own broad guidelines. But the bottom line is that any patient of sepsis who is going into early shock, that is any requirement of inotropes within 24 to 48 hours, with more than one organ system getting involved or MODA setting in, is an indication for using it. And if it is delayed more than 48 hours, if more than 3 organs are involved, if it is refractory shock, it is no longer required. So depending on the organ system involved, so they have made a criteria for Apache score more than this level, or different various ICU-based score, SOFA score more than this. So depending on the product you use, you can fine tune. They're all available online, and accordingly you can decide. But the basic concept remains that any sepsis who is going into multi-organ dysfunction with shock, and he is a candidate for intervention.
Dr. Behra, we would request you to please share on, I'll send you an email regarding
Yeah, sure.
You please share the indication so that we are also aware.
Sure. So I will share you for Cytosorb and Toremexin, as they are the two commonly used therapies.
Another question, Dr. Behra, is that you said that its cost is about 85,000 to 1 lakh rupees, and it is one-time use only.
Yeah.
So if we apply this Cytosorb or this extracorporeal therapy to one patient, how long it will work?
Each filter I have used for maximum 16 hours, one filter, but the average time they say is some 12 hours it should work. One filter, one cycle. And after that, the filter is fully saturated and it basically loses its effect. So the indication, most centers in most conditions use only one time. However, if you find that the inflammation is persisting, or you feel that there is some benefit, you want some more benefit, then you can, people have used multiple filters. So there is a role for having second use also, third use also. And as an anecdotal thing, I remember one private hospital using it for a very famous Swamiji for 8 to 10 times. Almost on a 1 in 3 day basis, they used it actually every 3 days. For 10 times they used it. But practically speaking, after about maximum 2 times or 3 times, there is no much benefit after that.
The effectiveness reduces.
Effectiveness reduces, but at the same time, 3 times using it, the cost exponentially goes up. So unless it's covered by insurance, so the cost exponentially goes up. So that is one big factor. Generally, one-time uses, if you can use early, it is good enough. And I would recommend that repeat it 1 time more. Third time, you be very sure if you are that is it required, and only then go ahead and treat it. Yeah.
So, Dr. Gajendra Kumar sir, he has raised his hand. President sir, yeah.
Yes. See, the modality is wonderful and it really works in the patient. But the impediment is, number 1 is cost. Number 2 is availability at most of the centers. I think this facility is not available at the district level or the sub-district level hospitals, because you need the technically expert people to handle it, number 1, and then you need the equipment to run it. So with this modality available, still there were so many deaths in even the big hospitals like All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So how you correlate both the things? The large number of deaths, even in the higher centers, and the availability of a mortality.
Absolutely, sir. Your first point is quite valid, that in small centers, it is not available. And more than an expert equipment, you require either a good critical care team or a good nephrology team, that they have to put that line in the central veins and then take out the blood, pump it out, and then send it back. So that requires some degree of expertise, but district level would be very difficult, but maybe in a zonal level or a state level, it is possible. So that is one. Number two, the reason for mortality, in fact, AIIMS is my parent center, and I have personally monitored and used it for some senior ministers and ex-prime ministers whom I don't want to name. So the main thing is timing. So if we intervene early and well in time, it is quite beneficial. So the people who don't benefit I feel, are the ones in which the inflammation has set in, has already caused the MODS, and it is a last ditch effort. For example, a VVIP or some center, private center, a very rich person comes and they want to just try out, whatever be the benefit, let's try it. So that indication becomes in many of the centers. So that is the reason it is not a miracle that you use it, the patient becomes all right. So it is in those patients, if you can identify and catch those patients early. So in those patients, the maximum benefit is seen. So a patient who is already very morbid, 80, 85-year-old, say a metastatic cancer patient who comes with multi-organ failure. So in those patients, it is more of a formality. It can be used, but the outcomes are poor.
Quite right. Thank you.
Dr. Rajiv Jain, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Behera. A very useful talk you had given, and very systematically you explained the concept behind ECMO and the science and how it has been used in COVID patients. There are two questions which come to mind. One is that the technology has advanced to a level where the cost, I believe, should have been reasonable, because more centers are there, and especially due to COVID, more people have started believing CytoSorb. And this technology needs to expand further very fast, because this will not only be used for COVID, this will be used for other eventualities where cytokine storm happens, especially in patients with shock. Even in the armed forces, there are, during the war situation or mass casualties, there will be number of patients who require early intervention with this technology. What are your views on that? Number one. Number two, in how many hospitals in the armed forces this technology with expertise available is actually there on the ground? If you could enlighten us a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So thank you for your questions. Firstly, I would just say that the cost is actually a mental block. A person requiring antifungal agents for 10 to 14 days, the cost would quite easily cross all these CytoSorb therapy. So, and antibiotics, antifungal, many of the patients are getting. So the cost is not that much. So that thing should be removed. So it cost in today's world, if he is in a tertiary care hospital, this is a affordable cost and worth the expenditure. Number two, technology basically just requires a good line and a pump. So either a good some good intensivist or some nephrologist can do it. So I think in district hospitals also, or some zonal centers also, this facility is well available. Yeah, coming to the question of mass casualty, of course. So as we discussed, any inflammation. So if there is some major mass casualty, a bullet injury or some trauma, so in that situation, definitely it has got a benefit. And but again, so it has to be started early and in time. So I totally agree with you that it is a very potential indication that in a mass casualty or a war or a disaster kind of scenario, that in whom so there we would be targeting not sepsis induced thing, but more of an inflammatory response. say someone has got a polytrauma with multi-organ involvement, with going into MODS, or severe hemorrhage going into MODS. So we can use it in that.
Road accident is a common occurrence.
Yeah. Pardon, sir?
Road accidents.
Yeah. Yeah, road accidents. Correct. So road accidents not upfront. See, after in a polytrauma case, after that 48 hours, 72 hours is gone. So some of them enter into that hyperinflammatory stage in which there is severe inflammation, cytokine storm. It can, if treated there, they can act. Now coming to armed forces, all our tertiary centers, we have some 10 to 12 tertiary care hospitals, which are basically command hospitals located at most of the metros. So all of them are having this facility, and the brand or the type of thing may vary, but all of them are capable, and it's a standard of care now.
So thank you, Dr. Rajiv Jain, sir. So there are one or two questions in the Q&A box. So I think you have already answered in reference to Dr. Rajiv's question. Which are the institutes where EC therapy is available apart from INS Ashwini? Here, Dr. Damodar Lele is our very senior member from Mumbai. Dr. Behra, if you can address this query. You're not audible. I think there is some connection problem.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sir. Hello.
Yeah. So
Actually, I just the technology finally at the last moment ditched me. So there was a power failure because of this monsoons. So I'm connecting with my mobile. Yeah. So sorry for the technical glitch. As we discussed.
Yeah. So you had already told that it is available. This therapy is available at many places. So can you address the query of Dr. Damodar Lele? He is our senior member from Mumbai. Where apart from INS Ashwini, which are the institutes where this extracorporeal therapy is available?
Correct, sir. So in Mumbai, this is the only hospital, so we have it here. In Pune, we are having it in Command Hospital. In Delhi, Bangalore, Calcutta, Lucknow. So all metros, in fact, all metros we are having it. So maybe 10 to 15 centers over the country, sir.
Okay. Then there is one question from Dr. Sanjay Rotitor, our Vice President IUH from Pune. He is asking how much is the duration of one cycle treatment and cost to the patient. You have already, I think, explained that it is 12 to 16 hours. The cost will be 85,000 to 1 lakh. That is
yes, sir. So this is the cost of only the
cytosorb, yes.
Of only the filter. Only the filter. Apart from that, there is that dialysis pump. So all that will be extra. And generally, the company says 12 hours, but we in a resource-limited country, instead of using 2 filters, we do the first filter for a longer duration and maybe maximize the use.
Okay. So I think we can conclude this session. It was a nice overview of the extracorporeal therapy. We would like to connect with you, Dr. Vineet, later on also. We can have some physical program also with you. And your this recording will be available on our Enoch DigiConnect YouTube channel. And that will be now the 79th video, which will be available of our these academic programs. And you can refer to it, and you can also subscribe it and request your friends also to subscribe. So thank you very much, Dr. Vineet. We'll keep in touch. Dr. Vineet.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, and I thank the organizers and everyone for patience.
Yeah, before parting, may I request Dr. Tyagraj also from Bangalore. He is there, although he has not raised his hand, but he has put on his video, so he wants to ask something from you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Decision making regarding management of this COVID SARS-2 is more authentic, informative, and instructional. And I just 2 questions I just wanted to ask. what is the role of this auxiliary membrane, which is a 4-in-1, which is used usually in end stage of the COVID SARS-2 patients, especially in the where there is the fibrosis of the lungs. And second thing is sometimes this in the fibrosis, this ECMO is not working properly. People are advising for lung transplantation. You have any opinion regarding the lung transplantation and COVID SARS-2 and auxiliary membrane? And as a nephrologist point of view, usually,
Yes, sir.
Usually the kidney is
am I audible?
less involved unless if the lung is completely gone, then only this there will be a kidney will be non-functional and it's going to the multi-organ failure. Will you throw some light on this, sir?
Dr. Vineet, you are not audible. Actually, there is some connection problem. So to conclude, sir, this was a nice session. Dr. Tyagaraja, sir, I'll ask him to connect with you and reply to your queries. And now our second speaker is our own Vice President, Senior Vice President of AUSD, Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain, sir. And I don't think Dr. Vineet Behera, are you?
Sir, I'm sorry. I'll just answer that question.
Yeah.
Firstly, the AU69 or auxiliaries, the concept remains the same. That it is also a therapy to remove the cytokines, but the mechanism there is mainly filtration. Whereas the cytosorb and all, the mechanism is adsorption. The concept remains the same. So even in that, before the patient goes into ARDS or lung fibrosis, if that membrane can remove the lung, the various inflammatory markers, the damage would be less. But the problem is that most people want to start it, say, after about 2 to 3 weeks of COVID. So at that time, the most of the inflammatory markers have already set in. So the actual benefit will be less. That is number one. Number two, about the second question about lung transplant. So lung transplant has been done successfully abroad for a few patients, but in India, no experience is available. But theoretically speaking, yes, any patient, if he is persisting to be having respiratory failure, COVID recovered, he can be a candidate for lung transplant. Abroad, it has been done in a few countries. India also, I think they have tried, but no data is available. That's all. So did I
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vineet Behera, for a broad presentation on this extracorporeal therapy. And we as industrial physicians, we are now more enlightened and more empowered with the concept. And now we can boldly face any question with our people, our workforce and our management also. We can answer them. We can address their queries regarding this extracorporeal therapies and especially the filtration therapies, when to start, how to start, and we would request you to share the indications, the guidelines when we should start and other details also. So thank you very much, Dr. Vineet. With this, we conclude the first session.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure joining you all and interacting with you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Have a good
Dr.
weekend.
Yeah. So thank you for the first session, and the second session is our COVID-19 EPID updates, which we had been conducting regularly every week. And we all know that COVID is still not over, and still we all need to be very careful. The pandemic is evolving in areas which were not affected earlier, and in many areas it is now coming as in many continents and countries, it is coming as third wave, although it is numbers are more, but the deaths and the hospitalizations are less because of the vaccination in these countries. The lot of mass vaccination has been, people have been covered with mass vaccination. In India, still we have to be very careful because our vaccination is not much because of our huge population, and we all need to be very careful because although the Sero survey has told that 2/3 of our population has got antibodies, but more than 40 crore of our population is still unaffected, and it is mainly in the rural areas and small towns which were earlier not affected by COVID, and they are susceptible for getting this infection. And even the vaccinated people, they need to be very careful because although they won't be they won't be getting severe form of COVID, but still they can get infected and they can transmit infection. So still it is time to follow all the COVID appropriate behaviors. And may I request our Senior Vice President AUSD, Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jansab, to give his presentation. He can share his screen and start the presentation. Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain is Senior Consultant Health in Indian Railways, New Delhi, with 40 years of experience in health and hospital administration, Fellow Award of IPHA and Fellow Award of Association of Environment and Occupational Delhi. And he has published more than 145 scientific papers and lot of fellowship and scholarships with WHO and the National Institute of Health, USA, and Canadian Society of International Health. So with this, sir, may I request Dr. Rajiv Jain, sir, to start his presentation. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. So once again, we take an update on epidemiological aspects of COVID-19 today. And we move forward from last Saturday to this Saturday and see what has happened in the world, in our regions, and in our country, in our districts, in our hinterland during the past 7 days, in the evolving pandemic of unparalleled seriousness and gravity. Next slide, please. This is the overall picture of the world in terms of the pandemic, starting from 13 January 2020 to this week. So if you look at the graph from last week, it is still going up on the right side. The third wave is evolving globally. The third wave, if you look at the extreme right, it is on the ascent at the moment, with major contribution from Europe and the Americas, and little contribution from Southeast Asia. If you look at the three colors, the yellow, the purple, and the green colors contribute the major contribution on the extreme right. If you look at the black line, that is the line for the deaths. Deaths also is following the same trend. In fact, if you look at the deaths, it is showing 4 peaks. The fourth peak is just started. First peak in early April, second peak sometime in January, third peak sometime in April and May, and now the fourth peak is just started. It is going up now globally. But you should not forget, if you look at the blue color at the bottom and the red color at the bottom on the extreme right, those are also important. Western Pacific and Africa, there also the trend is on the higher side, which is the indicator that in Africa, the infection is going to spread in the days and months to come. So we can see the infection pandemic is truly pandemic across the world. Next slide, please. Let's look at the data. This is the data as available on week. Now, what do we see? If you look at the new cases in the last 7 days, out of 100% to the extent of 34,29,000 cases globally reported, the highest contribution was from the Americas, 28%. Europe contributed 26%, and Southeast Asia region contributed 24%. Eastern Mediterranean 10%, Africa 6%, Western Pacific 6%. That makes up 34,29,000 cases in 7 days. But more important is the trend. What do we see in the trend? Globally, there has been an increase of 12% week on week. That is last week to previous week. And the highest growth has been in Europe. Once again, 21% increase in 7 to 7 days is in Europe, and 16% increase in Southeast Asia region, and Eastern Mediterranean region was again 15% increase. So what you see is something new. 30% increase in the Western Pacific region. Western Pacific region has shown the highest increase anywhere in the world out of the WHO regions, 30%. You should now realize Australia, which was almost seen to have conquered Corona, is now raging. There are lockdowns in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and city after city is under lockdown for more than 7 to 10 days. Western Pacific region is at the moment showing the highest increase week on week. It was never so in the previous weeks. Now, if you look at the deaths, the highest percentage of deaths during the last 7 days was contributed by the Americas, 39%, 22,000 deaths. 13% deaths were from Europe, 29% deaths were from Southeast Asia, 16,000 deaths, and 8% deaths from Africa, 7% from Eastern Mediterranean. But Western Pacific only showed 4% deaths. But the trend, if you see, overall trend was 1% growth on week, but the highest growth of deaths was in Southeast Asia region, 12%, and Western Pacific, 10% increase in deaths. So the trend is showing that deaths are maximum rising in Southeast Asia and Western Pacific region week on week. So that is the overall observation from this data set that is before you. Next slide, please. This is the coronavirus dashboard of the World Health Organization. If you look at the deaths in the region, as I told you, 7 days cases out of total reported 35,33,000, out of which maximum has been in Europe, 10,68,000, Americas 9,37,000, Southeast Asia 7,78,000, and other regions, none of the regions reported less than 1 lakh new cases in the 7 days period. So true pandemic even after 1.5 years. Next slide, please. This is the situation, which are the countries which are showing the highest number of cases in 7 days. What do you see? We had seen earlier that Indonesia was reporting the highest cases in the last 7 days. Now it is United Kingdom, 3,21,000 cases out of 35 lakh reported in 7 days. India reported 2,66,000, Indonesia 3,01,000, Brazil 2,64,000, United States 2,31,000, Russian Federation 1,70,000, and if you look at Iran, Spain, Colombia, and Argentina, all are showing more than 1 lakh. So all these countries are not located in one region of the WHO. These countries are located in diverse regions of the WHO, Southeast Asia, Americas, Europe, as well as Western Pacific and Eastern Mediterranean regions. So the pandemic is truly happening across the world. Next slide, please. If you look at the deaths, out of total deaths of 68,246 reported in 7 days, 9,000 were reported by Indonesia and Ecuador. Ecuador was never so high, 8,880 deaths. Brazil, 8,200 deaths. India, 6,900 deaths. And Russian Federation is still reporting more than 5,000 deaths in 7 days. Colombia 3,000 deaths, South Africa 2,600 deaths, Argentina 2,500 deaths, Myanmar, a new country in the top 10, 1,923 deaths, Mexico 1,700. So Indonesia and Myanmar close to India, they are showing very high number of deaths, as you will see data as well. What is the trend? Next slide, please. This is the Southeast Asia region. As you can observe with the graph, it is rising at the extreme right. If you see, the highest number of new cases were reported from Indonesia, 350,000. India reported 268,000. And the increase in Indonesia was 44%. Bangladesh reported 82,000 and 9% increase, while the highest weekly case incidence per population was registered in Maldives, Indonesia, and Thailand. The highest number of new deaths were reported from Indonesia, an increase of 21%, India, a decrease of 8%, 5,569, and Bangladesh, an increase of 9%, 1,475 deaths. So what do we see? It is there in our backyard. Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, all showing increased trend of deaths and cases. Next slide, please. This is now we come to India, globally, regionally, and now India. What do we see? Still 24 hours, new cases are almost 40,000 cases every 24 hours, 541 deaths. It is not coming down less than 500 deaths. 16 lakh tests are there in 24 hours. 7-day average test positivity is 2.2%. It is not going below 1%. After 1.5 years, 4 lakh active cases are there, and they are shrinking at minus 0.51, which is much lower speed than in the past. So it is not going down. Total 3.13 crore cases have been there. 4,20,000 deaths have been reported. 42.78 crore vaccination doses have been given. 39 lakh were given yesterday. Next slide, please. This is what the real data is. The sixth column, the extreme left column, the blue column, if you look at the states, confirmed cases out of 39,000 cases, 17,000 cases were in Kerala. So Kerala still is at the epicenter of COVID in India. Maharashtra is now reporting less number of cases. Yesterday is reported 6,700 cases. Odisha, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Assam, Manipur are all reporting more than 1,000 cases in 24 hours. And if you look at the deaths, Maharashtra still continues to report more than 100 deaths in 24 hours. Out of 541 deaths is reported 167 deaths. Kerala, 132 deaths, Odisha, 69, Karnataka, 30, Tamil Nadu, 24, Meghalaya, 21, West Bengal, 16, Manipur, 15, Assam, 15. So small states are still reporting good number of deaths as well. If you look at the green column, tests per million per day, the average is 1190 tests per million per day, but Rajasthan only testing 439 tests per million, West Bengal only 490 tests, Nagaland 679, Madhya Pradesh 889. So these states are still not testing enough numbers and not from enough sites within the states. In spite of the fact that Sikkim, Manipur, Mizoram, Kerala, and Meghalaya are all reporting 7-day average test positivity rate of more than 10%. So much so, Sikkim reported 17.6, Manipur reported 17.2, and Mizoram reported 14.5% 7-day average test positivity rate. And they are not testing enough. 7-day average daily growth, if you look at Indian average, is 0.12, while Mizoram has 2.19, Manipur 1.26, Arunachal 1.02, Sikkim 0.91, Meghalaya 0.84, Tripura 0.53, Kerala 0.47, Nagaland 0.34, Assam 0.3, And if you look, keep on seeing the figures, entire Northeast and Kerala are still reporting high daily growth percentage in terms of 7-day periods. If you look at the vaccinated persons with at least one dose in percentage, India has vaccinated 24% population with at least one dose, but that it hides the real situation on the ground, the variability, the inequity in distribution of vaccines across the country. Bihar has only given vaccine of one dose to only 14.7%. Uttar Pradesh has given to 15%, Jharkhand to 18%, West Bengal 19%, and Tamil Nadu 21%. So these states are large states and they have yet to give vaccination even one dose. Leave aside completing the second dose. Next slide, please. Yes, this slide shows you the real situation on the ground. Daily new cases are almost replacing the recovered cases, keeping the daily new active cases close to zero. There is no uptick in daily cases at the national level so far. The 7-day average of new cases still falling. So this is the overall trend. If you look at the blue and green and orange graphs, that is the overall trend from day one last year. Next slide, please. This is also important. This is a summary of phenotypic impact of variants of concern. Delta variant is of importance in our context. Transmissibility, Delta shows increased transmissibility at secondary attack rate. This in terms of disease severity, Delta shows increased risk of hospitalization. The risk of reinfection in Delta is reduction in neutralizing activity has been reported. For impact on diagnostics, none reported to date in terms of Delta. But more important is the presence of Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta all in our country. Next slide, please. This is also important, the effect of the vaccine and other aspects in terms of vaccine performance for the variants of concern. Protection retained against all outcomes. For Delta, protection retained against severe disease, possible reduced protection against symptomatic disease and infection. If we look at severe disease, we will see for AstraZeneca, there is no effect. Pfizer, BioNTech is a no effect. Symptomatic disease, if we look at Delta, in same or lower, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Bharat Biotech decreased, and AstraZeneca, Covishield is infection. If you look at, then AstraZeneca and Pfizer shows decrease. Neutralization, that is full vaccination. If for Delta is Janssen, the same reduction in recombinant AstraZeneca and Moderna vaccines, Covishield vaccine, but less in effect in terms of Pfizer, BioNTech, and Sinovac, also less effect. Next slide, please. This is the distribution of the 4 variants of concern across the world. The yellow one, top left, is Alpha, 180 countries, Beta, blue, 130 countries, and Gamma, 78 countries. The brown one on the bottom left. But most important is this purple bottom right is the Delta. Now it has gone to 124 countries, except for few countries in Africa and few in South America. Everywhere the Delta has spread, and it is causing havoc across Europe and Americas. Once again, more hospitalization and more deaths. Next slide, please. We shall now examine 2 aspects. First aspect is vaccination inequity, which is deepening globally. The World Health Organization which is backed the COVAX initiative, which was aimed at ensuring that poor countries would be able to access vaccines easily. However, the reality has been quite different. Data published by UNICEF shows that of the 50 countries that have received the most number of vaccines through this initiative, the 5 have a gross domestic product, that is GDP, of more than $20,000 per capita. India's, by comparison, is only 1,905. These are South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Canada, UK, and Australia. These 5 countries have received about 4.8 million vaccines. Next slide, please. So far, COVAX has delivered 136 million vaccines to 135 countries. This includes 16 million doses to 24 countries that would be categorized as low income by the World Bank criteria. 114 million vaccines to 90 middle income countries and 6 million to 21 high income countries. However, adjusted for population, by the high income countries are in this set got 2.4 doses per 100 people. The low income ones received only 2.2 doses. The middle income countries got 2.8 doses. This inequality exists as COVAX struggles to meet its initial goal of vaccinating more than 20% of its member nations' population with 1 dose. Middle and lower income countries were prioritized, yet among the 114 countries in these 2 sets, only 13 countries, all of them small island nations, have met the target. Some, such as Nigeria, where only 2% of the population had received 1 dose, face a potentially severe 3rd wave. Next slide, please. Himachal is leading in vaccination coverage among states over 5 million population. The COVAX vaccine shortfall has been partly because of the export controls imposed by the Indian government on Indian manufacturers of vaccines. This led Serum Institute of India, its biggest supplier, to halt its shipments until the end of the year. With increased supply, India has vaccinated 24% of its population with at least 1 dose, administered 3.8 doses a day in the past 7 days. Yet, this pace is inadequate to cover the entire adult population by the end of the year. Among states with more than 5 million population, Himachal Pradesh continues to lead in vaccine coverage, having given 629 doses per 1,000 people. Delhi 509, Kerala 488, and Uttarakhand 481 follow. The laggards, that is Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, have doubled their coverage in the last month. However, their gap with Himachal Pradesh has widened. Bihar increases dose per 1,000 people from 109 on 22nd June to 173 on 22nd July. Himachal jumped from 378 to 629 during this time. Next slide, please. 4 of the 5 districts with most COVID-19 cases this week are from Kerala. There has been a northeast surge. As India eases its restrictions, there are more pockets where infections are rising. As many as 15 states and union territories registered an increase in new cases this week as opposed to 8 last week. Among them, Kerala, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland have shown an increase in each of the past 3 weeks. In all, 67 districts from 19 states and union territories have witnessed an increase in cases registered in each of the last 2 weeks. Kerala's Malappuram reported 14,669 cases, the highest for a district. The northeastern states continue to see high case loads. Among the 10 districts showing the steepest incline this week, 8 belong to this region. Tamenglong in Manipur reported 193 cases this week, which is up from 105 last week and 44 2 weeks ago. Similarly, Kohima in Nagaland saw a sharp rise from 168 cases last week to 270 cases this week. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Maharashtra records a spike in deaths after data reconciliation. The number of deaths in India increased this week, partly because of a reconciliation exercise by Maharashtra, which added 3,500 deaths to the toll. In the process, Ahmednagar, Nagpur, and Nasik districts recorded more deaths, 517, 637, and 593 deaths, respectively, this week, up from last week's 60, 13, and 58. Two districts in Odisha, that is Khurda and Sundargarh, remain a cause of concern as weekly deaths there have not decreased since the first week of June. This week, their numbers doubled to 151 and 48 respectively. Khurda has vaccinated 50% of its population with at least one dose, while Sundargarh has managed 23%, marginally lower than the national average of 24%. Some states are seeing signs of recovery. Gujarat, Jharkhand, and Madhya Pradesh reported less than 10 deaths each in the last 7 days. However, as the pandemic has shown often, tides can change rapidly. So this is the first aspect we wanted to cover. Next slide, please. Second aspect is the review of the 6 months into India's vaccination drive. Let us see what is right and what is not. India, as you know, had launched its COVID-19 vaccination drive on January 16. 6 months into it, there has been visible improvement on most fronts. The pace has picked up, and the gender and urban-rural gaps are reducing. Still, more needs to be done if India wants to achieve its target of vaccinating its entire adult population of 940 million by the end of 2021. Next slide, please. If you look at the graph in this picture, 7-day average of daily new doses administered, you will realize the reality on the ground. India's vaccine supply has gone through several phases. In the first 3 vaccinations were opened up to healthcare workers, frontline workers, and those above the age of 60 years or over the age of 45 years, but with comorbidities. In all 3, the vaccines were sourced and supplied by the union government to the states and to the private centers. Starting April 1, vaccinations were opened up to those over the age of 45. In this phase 2, vaccines were procured and allocated to states and private centers by the union government. Starting May 1, India opened up vaccinations for everyone over the age of 18. This happened even as the supplies remained constrained. States were allowed to procure up to 25% of the vaccines made locally for this. Private hospitals were allowed to buy another 25%, and the remaining 50% were sourced by the union government for distribution to the states for healthcare and frontline workers and those over the age of 45 years. After the messy month and a half when supplies played truant and demand soared, the union government took over the sourcing of 75% of the vaccine starting June 21. The private sector continued to procure and administer 25%. The 7-day average of new doses administered reached an all-time high of 6.39 million on June 26, a number that India could never hope to sustain because it translates into a supply of 191.7 million a month. And in July, according to the Health Ministry, the supply is expected to be only 135 million doses. The numbers fell subsequently, reaching just 3.4 million on July 12. However, in the past week, the pace of vaccination has increased again. While still the peak of 6.9 million is significantly higher than it was before. Next slide, please. This is a graph which is showing the current pace of vaccine administration, which needs to increase to meet the December 31 deadline. What you see, target pace is 11.54. And what we are seeing is currently June 20, 4.32, July 12, 3.42, and June 26, 6.39. So the pace is nowhere near. The likelihood of achieving the target is unlikely. Next slide, please. This is another good news. The vaccination is in rural districts is increasing. The ratio of 7-day average of new doses per million population. Urban rural is on the red side. urban mixed is on the blue side. So you find improvement substantially on this ground. Next slide, please. This is another good news that more women are getting vaccinated now. Ratio of new doses administered to men and women in the country. 7-day average, the brown one is the new first doses per million population. The blue one is new doses per million population. If you look at the change, a change in the design of the gender-wise data on vaccination from June 21, 25, we now have data on total doses instead of the first dose. It does not allow us to keep track of this ratio anymore. However, there is no evidence to suggest that the trend towards gender equality in vaccination has reversed. This is a good thing to happen, 1.22 to 1.08, from 1.11 to 1.04. If this is maintained, we will have gender equity in vaccination. So there is good news and there is bad news. There is bad news in terms of vaccine supply, but there is good news in terms of gender equity and in terms of the vaccine happening in the rural districts of India. So there is inequity reduced in terms of geography and inequity reduced in terms of gender. So this is overall the current situation of COVID-19 epidemiology for this week. We will take up further developments next week, next Saturday. But before that, I would like to remind you, on next Friday, there will be at 6:30 p.m., there will be a session on Ocu Healthscapes, which will show you the condition and the development that have occurred during the last 1 month in the field of occupational and environmental health. Please do join at 6:30 p.m. on Friday at the same platform. Thank you so much. But before I end, I would like to show you a video for the Olympics that is just started yesterday evening, and that would give you some energy to go ahead and also clap for the Olympians which have gone from India and wishing them all the success. So enjoy this video.
लाए 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 हमने मचाया शोर गूंजे सारे सारे अंबर में छलके हौसले समंदर से लाए 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 Can you hear our voices roar? Through the Ganga climbing the Himalayas, bleeding courage we are warriors. ठान ले जो हम कर्म कभी चल पड़ते हैं रुकते नहीं Rising from the earth we strike tiger stripes the hero rise Here we come it's our time India we're here to fight And if we fall we get back up we're born to win we never stop say the Hindustani way हर पल हर दिल ये गाए the Hindustani way हर पल हर दिल ये गाए the Hindustani way जीत हमारी हर नस में the Hindustani way जीत हमारी हर नस में आए यहाँ जो करने वो करके हम दिखलाएंगे जीत की बाजी खेले हम और दिल को भी जीत के आएंगे Here we come, it's our time India, we're here to fight And if we fall, we get back up We're born to win, we never stop say जीत हमारी हम हिंदुस्तानी The Hindustani way हर पल हर दिल ये गाए The Hindustani way हर पल हर दिल ये गाए
Thank you once again.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv sir. Nice presentation and nice conclusion with a very energetic video. And definitely we would like to have more medals this time, despite this gloomy situation of COVID pandemic. May I request Dr. Gajendra Kumar sir, he has raised his hand.
First of all, I compliment Dr. Rajiv Kumar Jain for a wonderful presentation and equally good video presentation. So, my congratulations to you. Now my question, there are 2-3 questions which are coming up in my mind. With the current pace and the availability of vaccine, will India be able to cover its total population by December 2022, not 21 I am talking. This is number one. Because December 2021, certainly we are not going to achieve. Okay, this is first question. My second question is, in the Western media, in some of the articles I have read, that the number of deaths in India is 12 to 13 times more, and they approximated it to around 4.9 million or so, something. So what are your comments on that? Because the current national figures are 4 lakhs only, while they are telling it must not be less than 49 lakhs. So this is my second question. So your comments, please.
Well, both the questions are very relevant. The countries, not only the country like India is struggling with vaccine production and distribution and import. All the countries in the world are struggling, and they are struggling worse than India. To be able to vaccinate with one dose 24% of the population with India's size was a stupendous task. India has been actually able to deliver 24% of single dose of vaccine under very, very constrained environment. That's also a fact. Now, as I told you, when I was analyzing the vaccine global situation, what India had promised to the world, it could not meet because of its situation in the second wave in India. It prohibited Serum Institute of India from contributing the global pool. If you know, AstraZeneca had an agreement with Serum Institute of India. The global distribution of AstraZeneca vaccine was to happen from a factory in India, in Pune, by the Serum Institute of India. The government of India prohibited the Serum Institute of India commitment to the World Health Organization COVAX initiative. That's a global platform for distribution of vaccine to the poor countries. So India's advantage is at some other countries' disadvantage, mainly the very poor countries, mainly they are in Africa. Now, who will get protection, who will suffer, whether they will be in India's rural areas or in Africa's poor countries? If you visit Africa even today, they are worse than the worst slums in India or the worst rural areas in India. That is the reality of Africa even today. And they are not vaccinated. As I showed you, only 2% of the population has received even one dose. And then we are talking about a pandemic. So this cannot be a national issue. This has to be a global issue. Whether India gets protection by December 21 or 22 is not that important, as the world will get protection. That one has to see what is the priority. India not only requires vaccine from other countries, like you must have read today, Moderna, Cipla had an agreement to import. But what is likely? They will not be able to get a single dose in 2021. Not a single dose Moderna is going to give to India, because it's already made commitment to other countries. So the whole plan goes haywire. What to talk about the plan for 2022? The moot question is, how will the pandemic be rolling out? Could you visualize Indonesia getting so much deaths and infections in this pandemic itself right after India? Could you visualize Bangladesh getting affected? Could you tomorrow visualize Afghanistan getting affected? Could you visualize Myanmar getting infected, it is very much on our borders. So it is not that important that India will get vaccinated. It's equally important how will the infection get controlled and the vaccination gets paced up. That's a global question. And India need to have a global answer for this. That's part one. Second, regarding deaths are being examined at two levels. As I showed you last week, only 20% of deaths are registered with a medical cause of certification of death in India. This has been the truth for always since independence. In the last figure, 2019 was 21.2% registered deaths were with a cause of death, and not 100% are reported. Can you imagine Uttar Pradesh in normal times, only 30% deaths are reported, and only 20% deaths, only 5% have a medical cause of certification in their deaths in Uttar Pradesh. Bihar also is around 5% certificates of death have cause of death written on them. 95% deaths have got no certificate of cause of death. So what to talk about pandemic? Even in normal time, India is the reality. What will happen? So the system is deficient. Our SRS registration and civil registration system needs a lot of revamping. Entire structure of registration of deaths and the way they are reported needs to have an overhaul. The best state in reporting deaths with the cause of death are Maharashtra and Gujarat, and to some extent Kerala, to some extent Tamil Nadu. So those figures are more near reality, the less gap. But if you talk of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, there is likely to be a huge gap because of the reasons I've told you. Because normal time there is a gap, that gets magnified during pandemic. So we shall have to wait for an academic exercise for estimation of deaths during COVID-19 through verbal autopsy in the days and months and years to come. The earliest I can expect the truth figures to come is 2023. That is the current estimate, and that is through academic exercise by national institutions and international institution. That's a proper demographic exercise which is done always. Leave aside pandemic. That's the normal exercise which is done, which is continuing to be done.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Sandeep, please unmute.
Hello.
Hmm.
So, Dr. Tyagara sir, you have any question from Dr. Ajit?
Nothing to be asked.
Achha, okay. So, I think this
There
was
are
a
no
nice
questions.
session, sir. Any question, if you panelists have, they can unmute their video or they can raise their hand so that I can request them to put their question for the speaker. Else, we should conclude with a note that still we are in a very tough situation, and although vaccines, they have been given so much of emergency use authorization across the globe, but vaccine availability is a great problem.
It's a big question.
In India,
I find Dr.
although-
Pingle, our ICO board member, is present in the panel. I must thank him for especially asking and attending the EPID updates regularly. He has been a regular listener, and I find him to be available till the end and silent listener. And I appreciate the way he keeps his interest in all aspects of concerning occupational health. Dr. Pingle would like to make any comment?
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Jain. You save me from a lot of trouble. Otherwise, I would read all this. Earlier, I used to read into various places. Since you have started doing this, I have to spend only an hour per week. So it's a great help.
Welcome
Thank you
so much. Welcome.
Nowadays, what's happening is there are many clashes on Saturday evenings, but generally, I try to attend AUHD sessions.
Great. I'm delighted and gratified.
Thank you, Dr. Pingle sir. And there are also many other regular visitors. Dr. Maruti is there. Dr. Kishore Parekh, Joint Secretary IUH. They are also there. If they have any question or query, they can address. Yeah, Dr. Maruti.
Just one comment, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, just one comment, sir. Actually, so as Pingle sir was telling that instead of reading so much for a week and all, so just one session attending 1 hour, it will give a detailed idea for us what was happening, what is happening across the globe and India, including the individual districts. Also, we get to know by Jain sir's this presentation, sir. That's what I thank you all, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Maruti. In fact, that is the purpose of this epidemic update, because the data is not available at one place. For a pandemic, you need to be aware of what is happening in the world. It's not an epidemic in a small state, or it's not a national epidemic. It's a pandemic. So one needs to know what is happening. That is the core principle for having these rapid updates. Thank you for sparing your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So in fact, this Enoch DigiConnect webinar, although it is almost 1.5 years, Dr. Kishore Parekh, you want to say something?
Actually, what happened now is the Saturday is in our habit. We eagerly wait every time, every Saturday at what time Dr. Sandeep will start. So this is, I think, habit, and in future, if it is closed, then we'll be so unhappy. And
Well said.
and see, every program has its end in future. So it's so nice and very wonderful initiative. At the same time, we are very thankful to Rajesh sir that he has rightly said that every time, see, we can't gather the data, the letters are from different sites, but he is our Google or whatever you can say, Dr. Rajeev Jain sir. Okay, but every data we were centralized, and he is just highlighting every weekly. So we are thankful to him. It is very nice.
Welcome. Welcome. Thank
And
you,
Dr.
Dr.
Sandeep,
Parekh.
yes, you too.
Thank you,
coordinating
Dr.
every time.
Kishore Parekh, and compliments to you for your article today in Economic Times, Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
We have gone through the article, and it was a very nice, nicely articulated.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Dr. Shriniket, if you are so, actually, sir, this Enoch DigiConnect webinar series, it has given a lot of insight about this COVID pandemic, and every week, as rightly said by Dr. Pingle sir, Dr. Maruti, and Dr. Kishore, and every one of us, we say that we are eagerly waiting for this weekend, and so that at least we get some insight of the current situation, and it has helped us, and especially to, if I say in personal capacity, we get 3-4 points every week, which we can build on for discussion with our colleagues, and lot of clarity comes in our mind also, how to manage the pandemic in our respective organizations also. And every week we try to get one guest speaker who is master in his field, all qualified with different topics, so that some different flavors we can get about the whole this occupational medicine also. So thank you all very much, and Dr. Tyagaraj sir, your blessings and support always remains with us. You are always inspiring us to do more, and with this kind words, may I thank you all for joining this webinar, and we will all request you to join on Friday for OcuHealth Escapes this month end, and on Saturday we'll have another session with new speaker, and but for that time we can say good night, and thank you all very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good
Thank
night.
you all. Good night.